Let's step back. Number 8. Jebel Sahaba, the world's oldest war cemetery. In 1964, a team of archaeologists, led by Fred Wendorf, was racing against time along the Nile River in northern Sudan. The newly constructed Aswan Dam was about to flood dozens of archaeological sites, and they had days, maybe weeks, to rescue whatever they could before the rising waters swallowed everything. What Wendorf uncovered on the east bank of the Nile was a cemetery containing 61 skeletons, and when his team started examining the bones, they found something that shattered every assumption about early human societies. Broken bones, smashed skulls, stone arrowheads still embedded in ribs and vertebrae. This wasn't a peaceful burial ground. It was a war grave, and at 13,400 years old, it became the earliest known evidence of organized warfare in human history. 50 years later, in 2014, archaeologist Isabelle Crèvecoeur at the French National Center for Scientific Research began re-examining the bones, which had been stored at the British Museum since the original excavation. The results, published in Scientific Reports in 2021, revealed something far more disturbing than a single battle. Of the 61 individuals, 41 showed signs of violent trauma. 21 had stone projectiles lodged in their bones, embedded so deeply that they were still there 13,000 years later. But here's what makes Jebel Sahaba genuinely haunting. 16 of the skeletons had both healed and unhealed wounds, meaning these people survived one violent attack, recovered from their injuries, and then months or years later were killed in another attack. Men and women were equally likely to be wounded. This wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was decades of relentless, grinding violence, a pattern of raids and ambushes that stretched across generations. At the time of Wendorf's discovery, the idea that Stone Age hunter-gatherers waged organized war was considered impossible. Christopher Nussel, a physical anthropologist at the University of Bordeaux, pointed out that prevailing archaeological doctrine in the peace and love era of the 1960s held that war and violence were modern inventions, byproducts of agriculture and civilization. Jebel Sahaba destroyed that myth in a single excavation. The cemetery contains mostly the very young and very old, and the implication is brutal. Healthy adults were more likely to survive an ambush, escape an attack, or recover from their wounds, meaning the bodies left behind were the ones who couldn't run fast enough or fight back hard enough. The weapons used were designed specifically to kill. Projectile points with oblique or transverse cutting edges meant to slash arteries and cause rapid blood loss. These weren't hunting tools repurposed for conflict. They were weapons of war. Daniel Antoine, acting head of the Department of Egypt and Sudan at the British Museum, said it plainly. Violence appears to have been a regular occurrence and part of the daily fabric of their lives. The timing matters. 13,400 years ago, the planet was transitioning out of the last ice age and into the African humid period. Climate was unstable. Resources were unpredictable. Crèvecoeur's analysis suggests that resource competition, driven by climate change, gave local groups an incentive to raid their neighbors repeatedly over the course of years, maybe decades. What is certain, Crèvecoeur said, is that acts of violence are recorded since hundreds of thousands of years ago. The pattern is unmistakable. Scarcity plus population density equals warfare, and that equation hasn't changed in 13,000 years. Here's the part that makes Jebel Sahaba especially tragic. The site no longer exists. It now lies beneath Lake Nasser, submerged under the reservoir created by the Aswan Dam. Vendorf and his team pulled those 61 skeletons from the ground with days to spare before the floodwaters arrived. The voices of those individuals, their names, their fears, the specific reasons they fought and died over a stretch of riverbank that no longer exists above water, all of it is gone. The only thing that survived was their broken bones, and even those almost didn't make it. They were rescued from the rising Nile at the last possible moment, silent witnesses to the oldest war we've ever found. Number 7. Nataruk, the massacre that proved war predates civilization. In 2012, archaeologist Dr. Marta Mirazon-Lahar was leading excavations in northern Kenya, about 30 kilometers west of Lake Turkana, when her team found fragments of human bones scattered across the surface of what is now barren desert. By the time the dig was finished, they had uncovered the remains of 27 people, including 6 young children, 1 teenager, and 20 adults. 12 of the skeletons were complete enough for detailed analysis, and 10 of those showed unmistakable signs of violent death. Extreme blunt force trauma to skulls and cheekbones, broken hands, knees, and ribs, arrow wounds to the neck, stone projectile tips still lodged in the skull and thorax of 2 men. 4 individuals were found in positions suggesting their hands had been bound at the time of death, including a woman in the final stages of pregnancy. This wasn't a skirmish that got out of hand. This was a planned military-style assault that happened 10,000 years ago, long before anyone built the first cities, developed agriculture, or invented writing. The discovery, published in the journal Nature, sent shockwaves through the archaeological community because it directly contradicted decades of accepted theory. For years, many scholars had argued that warfare only emerged after humans settled down, started farming, and developed complex political systems that created hierarchies worth fighting over. The idea was that hunter-gatherers, who owned almost nothing and moved constantly, had no reason to wage organized war. Nataruk proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. 10,000 years ago, the area around Lake Turkana wasn't a desert. It was lush, fertile, and rich with resources. The lake was much larger than it is today, providing abundant fishing and drinking water. The people buried at Nataruk had been living in what was likely an ideal location for prehistoric foragers, and the presence of pottery at the site suggests they were storing food, which means they had something valuable enough that someone else wanted to take it by force. The attack itself was methodical and brutal. The killers used a combination of distance weapons like arrows and close proximity weapons like clubs and stone knives, which suggests premeditation and planning. You don't carry weapons like that while fishing or gathering wild plants. You carry them when you're going to war. Luke Glowacki, an anthropologist at Harvard University, pointed out that this shows 2 of the conditions associated with warfare among settled societies, control of territory and resources, were probably the same for these hunter-gatherers, and that we have seriously underestimated their role in prehistory. The injuries suffered by the people of Nataruk shock for their mercilessness, said Mirazon-Lahar. Men and women, pregnant or not, young and old, all of them were targeted without discrimination. There's no evidence that anyone was spared. What makes Nataruk particularly chilling is what it reveals about human nature. Robert Foley, also from Cambridge University, said he has no doubt it's in our biology to be aggressive and lethal, just as it is to be deeply caring and loving, and that a lot of what we understand about human evolutionary biology suggests these are 2 sides of the same coin. Violence isn't something we invented recently. It's been part of us for as long as cooperation and empathy have. Mirazon Lahar noted that what we see at the prehistoric site of Nataruk is no different from the fights, wars, and conquests that shaped so much of our history, and indeed, sadly continue to shape our lives. The bodies at Nataruk were never buried by their killers. They were left exposed on the shore of the lagoon where they died, and over thousands of years, sediment gradually covered them, preserving their remains in the exact positions they fell. A pregnant woman lying face down in a dried lagoon bed, her hands likely bound behind her back. 10,000 years of silence. The name of the person who killed her, the tribe they belonged to, the specific reason they crossed the water that morning with weapons in hand. All of it lost to the same soil that preserved her bones, as evidence that war is older than civilization, older than farming, older than everything we thought made us human. Number 6. The Talheim Death Pit, Europe's first genocide. In 1983, excavators working in the small town of Talheim in southwestern Germany uncovered a mass grave that would fundamentally change how archaeologists understood early European farming communities. The pit contained 34 skeletons, 16 children, 9 adult men, and 7 adult women, all crammed into a shallow burial that measured just a few meters across. When researchers examined the skulls, they found a horrifying pattern. 18 had been struck with the sharp edge of stone adzes, the same polished stone tools that Neolithic farmers used to clear forests and work timber. 14 more had been killed with the blunt edge of those same tools. 2 or 3 individuals showed evidence of arrow wounds. This wasn't a battle where people died defending themselves. The skeletons showed no defensive wounds on their forearms, no shattered bones from trying to block incoming strikes. These people were running when they were cut down from behind, and whoever killed them used the exact same farming tools that the victims themselves would have carried every single day. The Talheim Death Pit dates back to around 5000 BC, placing it squarely within the linear band ceramic culture, or LBK, the first agricultural society to spread across Central Europe. For decades, many archaeologists believed these early farming communities were peaceful, cooperative groups who worked the land together and shared resources without major conflict. The discovery at Talheim, along with similar mass graves found later in Germany and Austria, forced a brutal reassessment. Lawrence Keeley, an archaeologist from the University of Illinois, famously said that once may be an accident, twice may be coincidence, but thrice is a pattern, and the Talheim grave was just the beginning of a pattern that would emerge across Neolithic Europe. The evidence now suggests that violence and the massacre of entire communities were relatively frequent occurrences during this period, not rare exceptions. What makes Talheim especially disturbing is the demographic makeup of the dead. Young women are conspicuously underrepresented in the grave, leading researchers to theorize that they were taken alive, possibly as captives, while everyone else was killed. The motive may have been straightforward. The capture of women could have been the primary reason for the raid in the first place, a way to secure reproductive partners and eliminate a rival group's ability to sustain itself across generations. The grave sits near what appears to have been a border between 2 distinct LBK trading networks, meaning these weren't random strangers attacking from distant lands. These were neighbors, possibly groups who had lived within a day's walk of each other for years, and at some point, the competition for land, resources, or people became violent enough that one group decided to wipe out the other. Several of the skeletons at Talheim show signs of healed trauma from earlier injuries, meaning violence wasn't a one-time event for these people. It was habitual, something that happened repeatedly over the course of their lives. Lawrence Keeley also proposed a theory that sounds almost supernatural, but may have a basis in the belief systems of the time. He suspects that after killing the villagers, the attackers deliberately smashed their shin bones to disable their ghosts, preventing the dead from pursuing their killers into the afterlife. Whether or not that's true, the fact remains that someone took the time, after the killing was done, to systematically break the legs of people who were already dead, which suggests ritual, belief, and a level of psychological investment in the act that goes beyond simple resource competition. Among the 34 bodies were 16 children. The youngest was only 6 months old. The tools that killed them were the same ones their parents used to farm the soil, and the people who carried out the massacre were likely their neighbors, speaking the same language, growing the same crops, living under the same sky. We know the method. We know the weapons. We know the bones were dumped in a pit and covered with earth. What we'll never know is the exact moment it started. The morning someone looked across the valley at another village and made the decision to walk over there carrying an adze, not to build, but to destroy. Number 5. Asparnschletz, when an entire village vanished. In 1983, archaeologists began systematic excavations at a Neolithic fortified settlement in Lower Austria, and what they found over the following years would become one of the most disturbing snapshots of prehistoric violence ever documented. The site dates to around 5200 BC and belonged to the linear pottery culture, the same farming society responsible for the Talheim massacre. This settlement was different, though, because the people who lived there knew trouble was coming. They had built not one, but 2 concentric defensive ditches around their village. Massive earthworks that would have required coordinated labor from the entire community. They dug those trenches to keep someone out, and in the end, it didn't matter. The defenses failed, and when archaeologists excavated roughly 20% of the outer ditch, they found the skeletal remains of 67 individuals dumped at the bottom. If that's 20%, the entire ditch system could contain upwards of 300 bodies, making Asparnschletz one of the largest known prehistoric massacre sites in Europe. The condition of the remains tells a brutal story. Without exception, every skeleton recovered showed multiple traumatic injuries. All but one of the skulls displayed blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck repeatedly by LBK-type stone adzes, or axes, the same farming tools seen at Talheim. One individual had been killed by an arrow. The bodies weren't buried immediately. They were left in the open ditch for months, long enough that carnivores gnawed on the bones, and scavengers scattered limbs across the site. Arms and legs were missing. Severed skulls were found separately from the bodies they belonged to. Many of the dead had been laid face down in the dirt, and the position suggests they were thrown or dumped rather than carefully placed. The demographic breakdown included 27 children, 26 men, and 13 women, with 1 adult of undetermined sex. What's conspicuously absent are young women. The researchers concluded that young females were likely abducted by the attackers, taken alive while everyone else was killed. This wasn't a raid that escalated unexpectedly. This was total annihilation. Demographic analysis presents the picture of an entire population having been extinguished, and the findings strongly suggest that a genocide scenario may have been responsible for the final demise of this settlement. The fortifications that the villagers trusted to protect them became their tomb. After the attack, the settlement was never reoccupied. No one came back to rebuild. No one reclaimed the land. The site was abandoned, and over the following millennia, soil gradually filled in the ditches and buried the evidence until modern excavators uncovered it 5,000 years later. The massacre at Aspern-Schletz occurred around the same time as the killings at Talheim, and later at Schöneck-Kilienstetten, suggesting that the late LBK period across Central Europe was characterized by widespread social instability and violence, on a scale that archaeologists are only now beginning to fully understand. The question of why this happened remains open. Some researchers point to climate change, droughts that disrupted agricultural productivity and forced groups to compete more aggressively for arable land. Others suggest overpopulation, a scenario where LBK settlements expanded too quickly and ran out of space, leading to territorial conflicts that spiraled into full-scale extermination campaigns. Still others propose that the LBK culture itself may have been undergoing a systemic collapse, with internal tensions, resource depletion, and possibly even cannibalism appearing at certain sites during this same period. What's undeniable is that these were not isolated incidents. The pattern repeats across multiple sites, across multiple regions, all within a narrow window of time. An entire fortified village, men, children, elders, all of them killed and dumped into the defensive ditch they had spent months or years digging to protect themselves. The young women were taken. The bodies were left for the animals. After months of exposure, someone finally pushed enough dirt over the remains to cover them, and the settlement area was never inhabited again. The people who built those walls never imagined the walls wouldn't save them. Whatever they called their village, whatever gods they prayed to inside it, it all ended one morning and no one ever came back. Number 4. Schöneck-Kilienstetten, the massacre that broke every rule. In 2006, a construction crew building a road near Frankfurt, Germany, uncovered human bones. And, when archaeologists from the University of Mainz arrived to investigate, they realized they were looking at another LBK mass grave. The site was dated to between 5200 and 4800 BC, roughly the same time period as Talheim and Aspern-Schletz, and the initial excavation revealed the incomplete skeletons of 13 adults, 1 teenager, and 12 children. 10 of those children were under 6 years old. The youngest was only 6 months old. When researchers began analyzing the trauma patterns on the bones, they found the same blunt force cranial injuries seen at other massacre sites, the unmistakable signature of stone adzes smashing through skulls. But then they found something else, something that had never been documented at any other prehistoric site. More than 50% of the shin bones recovered from the grave had been deliberately and systematically broken around the time of death. The study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015, presented what the authors called indisputable evidence for another massacre. The fractures to the lower legs were fresh, meaning they occurred either immediately before, during, or shortly after the individuals were killed. The bones weren't broken by accident or by post-mortem damage from soil pressure. They were targeted intentionally, and the frequency of the injuries suggests it was part of a deliberate pattern. The question that has divided researchers ever since is why. One theory is torture. If the attackers broke the legs of their victims while they were still alive, it would have caused excruciating pain and ensured that no one could run away. But Lawrence Keeley, the same archaeologist who analyzed the Talheim site, isn't convinced. He pointed out that torture typically focuses on the parts of the body with the most nerve endings: feet, hands, and the head, not the middle of the shin. His alternative explanation is even more unsettling. He suspects the attackers smashed the victims' shins after they were already dead to disable their ghosts, preventing the spirits of the murdered from pursuing their killers into the afterlife. Whether it was torture or ritual mutilation, the implications are the same. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment killing. This was systematic, planned, and executed with a level of deliberate cruelty that goes beyond anything required for simple survival or resource competition. The demographic profile at Schöneck-Kilienstätten is virtually identical to the one at Talheim. The ratios of children to adults strongly indicate that this was a complete community, probably biologically related people who lived together in a single settlement, and the entire group was wiped out in one event. Just like at the other sites, young women are significantly underrepresented in the grave, suggesting they were taken alive. The rest were killed, mutilated, and dumped in a commingled mass grave where their bones were mixed together without any care for individual identity. The Schöneck-Kilienstätten grave was discovered during road construction, not during a planned archaeological survey. A highway crew almost paved over it. If the timing had been slightly different, if the construction schedule had moved a little faster, the evidence would have been destroyed completely, ground into the roadbed, and lost forever. Instead, we have the bones of 26 people, including a 6-month-old baby whose legs were broken either before or after death. We know the weapon. We know the bone. We know the culture that did it. We know they were Europe's first farmers, people who invented agriculture in Central Europe and spread it across the continent. We know they grew wheat and barley, raised cattle, built houses, made pottery, and lived in organized villages. And we know that at some point, around 5000 BC, they started systematically killing each other's children and breaking their legs, either to make them suffer or to stop their ghosts from coming back. What we will never know is whether the baby cried before or after. Number 3. Potocani, the execution nobody can explain. When human remains were first discovered at a construction site in eastern Croatia, archaeologists from the University of Zagreb were called in, and their initial assumption was that they were looking at victims of modern warfare, possibly from World War II or the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s. But when they examined the bones more closely, there were no bullets, no uniforms, no evidence of modern dental work. The teeth showed no fillings. Fragments of ancient pottery were scattered among the remains. Radiocarbon dating of 3 bones came back with a result that shifted the entire investigation 6,200 years into the past. These weren't casualties of recent war. They were victims of a mass execution from the Neolithic period, and by the time excavations were complete, researchers had uncovered the remains of at least 41 men, women, and children who had been killed in what appears to be a single coordinated event. The study, published in PLOS 1 and led by Mario Novak at the Institute for Anthropological Research in Zagreb, included the largest genetic analysis ever conducted on an ancient massacre, and the results were baffling. DNA testing revealed that the victims were mostly unrelated to each other. These weren't families. They weren't members of the same household or even the same extended kinship group. Isotopic analysis of their teeth and bones showed that they had grown up in different locations, eating different diets, meaning they came from separate communities scattered across the region. Someone had gathered 41 people from multiple settlements, brought them to this location, and killed them all at once. The positions of the skeletons suggest they were immobilized, likely kneeling or crouching with their hands tied behind their backs when they died. There were no defensive wounds on their forearms, no facial injuries from trying to block incoming blows. Novak's conclusion was unambiguous. They were not defending themselves. I would say this was a pre-planned mass execution. What makes Potocani genuinely mysterious is what's missing. There is no evidence of who the killers were. No weapons were left behind. No camp. No graves of attackers. No traces of the people who committed this atrocity. As Novak put it, the perpetrators could have been a rival group from another region, or they could have been from the same population as the victims. The cultural context doesn't help much either, because the victims belonged to the Lasinja culture, one of the least studied prehistoric complexes in the region. Almost nothing is known about how these people lived, what their social structures looked like, or what kinds of conflicts they might have been involved in. The only thing researchers can say with certainty is that this was not the result of warfare in the traditional sense. Mass graves from combat typically contain mostly young males, the people who would have been fighting. Potocani had men, women, and children in roughly equal proportions, and the lack of defensive injuries means this wasn't a battle that turned into a massacre. It was an execution from the start. Researchers have speculated about climate change playing a role. Around 6,200 years ago, environmental conditions across Europe were shifting. Resources like water, vegetation, and game animals were becoming less predictable. Extreme weather events were more common. These kinds of disruptions tend to destabilize human societies, and groups sometimes respond by trying to take over others' territories or eliminate perceived threats before they become actual threats. But that's speculation. The truth is, no one knows. Compounding the mystery is that no adjoining settlement has ever been found near the mass grave. There's no village, no evidence of where these people came from or where they were going. They were brought to this spot, forced to kneel, killed, and buried, and the people responsible vanished from the archaeological record as completely as if they never existed. 41 people executed, not families, not warriors, not a unified community. Mostly strangers to each other, gathered from different regions, kneeling with their hands bound. No one knows who gave the order. No one knows what the crime was, if there even was one. Mario Novak said it plainly. Unless some clear-cut archaeological evidence is found nearby, I don't think we will ever find out. The killers left no tools, no weapons, no camp, no graves of their own. They appeared, executed 41 people, and vanished from history completely, leaving behind only the kneeling dead and 6,200 years of unanswered questions. Number 2. Crow Creek, North America's bloodiest day in prehistory. In the 1950s, during construction of the Big Bend Dam on the Missouri River in South Dakota, excavators uncovered human remains at a site that would later be named Crow Creek. Additional excavations in 1978, led by archaeologist Larry Zimmerman from the University of South Dakota, revealed the full scale of what had happened there. The remains of at least 486 individuals were pulled from a mass grave located in the fortification ditch that had once surrounded a large village. 95% of the intact skulls showed cut marks from scalping. Most of the bodies bore signs of ritual mutilation. Tongues had been removed, teeth were broken, hands and feet had been cut off, likely taken as trophies. This wasn't just a massacre, it was systematic butchery carried out on a scale unmatched anywhere else in prehistoric North America, north of Mexico, and it all happened in a single day around 1325 AD. The village at Crow Creek was enormous by the standards of the time. It covered over 30 hectares and contained more than 1,000 houses, representing one of the largest settlements along the Missouri River during the initial coalescent period. The inhabitants had built defensive fortifications around the village, a palisade and a ditch meant to protect them from external threats, and the evidence shows they were in the process of replacing an older fortification with a new, expanded defensive system when the attack occurred. They never finished it. The attackers breached the palisade from the outside, tore it down, stormed the village, and killed nearly everyone inside. The estimated 486 dead represent roughly 60% of the total village population, meaning this wasn't a raid that targeted warriors or specific families. This was an attempt to erase the entire community. What makes Crow Creek especially disturbing is the condition of the victims before the attack even happened. Skeletal analysis revealed chronic malnutrition across the population. The bones showed iron deficiencies, signs of repeated stress, and evidence of earlier violent injuries that had healed over time, suggesting that the people of Crow Creek had been living under sustained threat for years before the final massacre. They were already starving, they were already weakened, and they were already being attacked periodically by neighboring groups. The massacre wasn't an isolated event. It was the culmination of escalating violence driven by competition for arable land and bison hunting territory in a region experiencing environmental stress. The attackers weren't outsiders. They were other initial coalescent groups from the same cultural tradition, speaking related languages, living in similar villages just miles away along the same river system. After the killing was done, the bodies were left exposed above ground for a period of time before being dumped into the fortification ditch. The evidence of mutilation suggests the attackers spent hours, maybe days, systematically desecrating the dead. The village was burned. The survivors, if there were any, scattered. The site was abandoned and remained unoccupied for generations. In 1979, after years of study, the remains were reburied at the Crow Creek site at the request of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe, whose ancestors include the Mandan and Arikara nations, the likely descendants of the people who lived and died there. The reburial attracted international attention as one of the largest and most respectful returns of Native American remains in history, and it marked a shift in how archaeologists approach the study of indigenous prehistory. 486 people, 95% scalped, hands and feet removed as trophies, tongues cut out, village burned to the ground, and then 700 years of silence until a dam construction project in the 1950s accidentally broke ground on the mass grave and brought the evidence back to the surface. The Mandan and Arikara people know these were their ancestors. They reburied the bones with the honors and respect that were denied in 1325. They know who these people were. The rest of us do not. We know the numbers. We know the wounds. We know the weapons. We will never know their names or what they called the village they died defending or the exact moment the palisade came down and the screaming started. Number 1. Goma lava, women and children targeted by design. In a study published just this year in Nature Human Behavior, researchers from University College Dublin, the University of Edinburgh, the University of Copenhagen, and the Museum of Vojvodina documented one of the largest and most disturbing prehistoric mass killings ever found in Europe. Inside a shallow pit at the archaeological site of Gomolava in northern Serbia, they uncovered the remains of 77 people who died together around 2,800 years ago during the early Iron Age. The pit itself was only about 9.5 feet wide and less than 2 feet deep. What made this discovery stop researchers cold wasn't just the number of dead, it was who they were. Of the 77 victims, 40 were children between the ages of 1 and 12. 11 were adolescents, 24 were adults, and 87% of those adults were female. This wasn't collateral damage from a battle that went wrong. This was the plan from the beginning. Genetic testing revealed something that genuinely shocked the research team. The victims were mostly unrelated to each other. Not just distantly related, completely unrelated, meaning not even their great-great-grandparents were connected. Barry Malloy, the co-lead researcher from UCD School of Archaeology, said they initially expected to find families from a village that had been attacked, but the DNA told a different story. Isotopic analysis of teeth and bones showed the victims had diverse childhood diets, indicating they came from different settlements scattered across the region. Someone had gathered these people, women and children from multiple communities who didn't know each other, brought them to Gomolava, and killed them in a single coordinated act. The evidence suggests they were immobilized, possibly kneeling or crouching, when they died. Their bodies were then carefully buried with offerings, bronze jewelry, ceramic drinking vessels, a young calf placed at the bottom of the pit, seeds burned above the bodies. This wasn't a hasty disposal. It was a ritual. The question that haunts this discovery is why. In most conflicts throughout history, women and children are taken as captives, absorbed into the attacking group, used as labor or leverage. At Gomolava, they were killed in large numbers, deliberately selected and eliminated. Removing younger individuals disrupts reproduction, labor systems, and marriage alliances that bind communities together. The researchers argue that targeting these specific demographics was meant to send a message, a brutal demonstration of power, designed to terrorize surrounding populations. The timing matters. The early Iron Age in the Carpathian Basin was a period of social upheaval. Communities were building enclosed settlements, reoccupying old Bronze Age mounds, and asserting territorial claims over grazing lands and trade routes. Mobile pastoralist groups clashed with semi-sedentary farming communities. Resources were contested. Boundaries were fluid. Violence was a tool for establishing dominance. What makes Gomolava uniquely disturbing is the care taken after the killing. The perpetrators didn't just murder these people and walk away. They performed a ritual over the bodies. They placed valuable goods with the dead. They burned offerings. They marked the grave with post holes, suggesting a structure once stood above it. A second mass grave discovered at Gomolava in 1954 contained mostly female skeletons from the same era, indicating this wasn't an isolated incident. This was repeated, organized violence targeting specific segments of the population across multiple events. The people who did this weren't opportunistic raiders. They were methodical. They planned. They selected. They ritualized. And then they walked away, leaving 40 children, 11 teenagers, and 24 women buried in a pit 9 feet wide with a message carved into demographics and bone that we will never be able to fully read. Not warriors, not soldiers, not a community defending itself. 40 children between 1 and 12, 11 teenagers, gathered from different settlements across the region, unrelated to each other, killed with intention, buried with offerings. The ritual meant something to the people who performed it. The bronze jewelry, the ceramic vessels, the calf at the bottom, the burned seeds above. What it meant, what message it was meant to send, who received it, whether it worked, all of it permanently, irreversibly gone. Every massacre on this list was brutal, but Goma Lava is different, because whoever did this didn't just kill. They planned it. They selected their victims carefully, and they marked the act with ceremony, leaving 77 bodies and a meaning we will spend generations trying to understand, and will likely never fully recover.